Okay, let's get started. So, a reminder that on Thursday we have a guest lecturer coming to class, and you can make 20 points of extra credit by coming and listening to the presentation, and then writing a short paragraph afterwards. Our visitor is Dr. Fan Bin Zheng from China, and he'll be talking about the relationship between social media and citizen participation. And I think it should be very interesting just to hear about communication in another country, social media in another country, which is maybe a little less open than our own. So that could be interesting. Hi, Sarah. And so to take advantage of this, please click on this link and just fill in your first and last name and your email, just so you have we reserve you a seat here. Of course, those of you who don't want to come and get extra credit are welcome to stay home and stream the class if that's the way you're usually doing it. But I encourage everyone to come on Thursday for a little extra credit. Any questions about it? I've been selling it as best I can, and I've alerted clubs and other departments. Ron?
So you just basically show up and you write out the notes, and then you write a summary of it?
Yeah, you don't even have to write a summary. It's sort of more like just a feedback if you want. Sort of like, oh, look, the things that I found interesting was to learn that, I don't know, Facebook is blocked in China, but they have their own version of it or something like that, So then you just, that kind of feedback. That would be great. And I can pass that on to the lecturer if it sounds like something that would be interesting to them. They always, this is a person who teaches somewhere else. Does it say where he teaches? It's first of all, Fulbright Scholars are. It's an honor to be a Fulbright Scholar. It's a competitive thing, and you get some money to travel to another country, do your scholarship, and present your work and stuff, and then go home. And hopefully you've learned something from interacting. So that's part of it. So he is at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is one of the premier research universities in the country. So it should be interesting. Like many of our students here at CCSF, he is the first of his family to attend college. That's totally cool. Okay, so again, just to take advantage of that, click on the big red link and let us know to save you a seat when you're coming. Terrific. So that's Thursday, this week, almost upon us. Otherwise, today we're going to start talking about academic research into communications. Some of the early research is among the most interesting and still pertinent research. If you ask me, it's become very, very specific and maybe more of interest to scholars and people in graduate school. But some of the early research that we'll talk about today, I'm hoping you'll find some echoes in the current issues that we face. And so some of those might be something you could actually apply to your real life thinking about stuff. So we'll get on to that in a second. Before that, just wanted to look over a last topic or maybe two of the topics that you can choose from for your research paper. So remember, that is due on May 15th, last class, 2:30. We will be in class reviewing for the final exam on that day, of course, but I'd like you to think about what you want to write about already. So we've talked about the first few of them. This one, which is sort of like looking at 3 television shows and trying to discern from the show what the target audience is, looking at the ads that are placed in that show, seeing if you can find a link between the target audience and the advertisement that's put there, and usually you can. So that's one possibility. The second one, a discussion of satellite radio, which could lead you into talking about, how hard it is to compete with an advertising supported model where radio is free versus a subscription-supported model, which is Sirius XM. So, you know, the difficulty there is how do you get people to pay for something they could get almost the same for free? Not quite the same. Also, it invites you to talk about some of the draws that satellite radio have, such as high-profile personalities. Did that work out? And generally give your opinion on the viability of a kind of satellite radio. Another one which involves a certain amount of research, maybe a call to a local station, maybe looking into Wikipedia. This one is to write a biography of a local radio station. So some of them have been around for 60, 70 years. And so that would be a long biography. You want to pick one that is reasonably long, not something, just that started a few years ago. And what the interest here is just to see how, one station morphs over time, adopts different formats, how that might relate to, the changing society, the changing business around those decades. And typically, Wikipedia will have not only a list of all the format changes that happened at that radio station, but we'll also probably, talk about a couple of, regulatory highlights or things that have changed the business a bit. For instance, 1996, remember the Telecommunications Act lifted the cap on the number of radio stations that you could own nationwide. Anyway, there's still a cap, so you can't own more than 8 AM FM stations here in the Bay Area, for instance. But nationwide, you could own 8 here, and you could own 6 in another market and 5 in another market. You could literally have 1,000 radio stations if you were Clear Channel. So that would, for instance, be a huge transitional force in the history of radio. You look around 1996 and you'll probably find a lot of small stations getting bought, and that would involve changing formats and other stuff. So biography would cover, purchases, acquisitions, mergers, and also format changes. So that could be pretty cool. And what would be great would be to either call or email a station that you're researching and sort of say, could anybody there give me, either a couple minutes on the phone or maybe answer my 2-3 questions here by email. And that's really just to, make contact and get somebody at the station to tell you a little bit about the station. And it is actually not as hard as you'd think, because there are people in the radio station whose job is community outreach. They have to be there. They have to help you. So that's something that would be good. All right, let's look at another one here. We're into social media. So this one, new for today. So let's spend a little more time on it. Discuss the pros, cons, and implications of the proliferation of social networking tools being used in news reporting, such as blogs, Facebook, YouTube, Reddit, and Twitter. These so-called news sources have been credited with becoming a primary news source for many in younger demographic groups. Are these the new channels of news distribution, or merely a trend or something else entirely? Your discussion should include recent events that have been impacted by social networking as a news source. Do we have any news junkies here, apart from me? News junkies? Ron, are you a news junkie? No? No? Maybe Dylan? Yeah. Ron, what?
I just don't reply. I don't really care.
Okay. Okay. I don't know, for some reason when you get older, you get more into the news in general. It may not happen to you, but definitely happened to me. Really?
Sorry.
So, if you are interested in thinking about how news is being impacted by being distributed online, this would be a really interesting topic. If you don't necessarily want to read a book or an article about it, there's a great show it's a great documentary called News Wars. I used to show it, but then I kind of ran out of time when we changed format on this course and stuff. But News Wars is a PBS documentary in 2 parts. And I might try next week just to show you like a trailer or a highlight reel or something from it. So, some of the trends that it demonstrates are, first of all, the collapse of print as a news source, partly because it was being supported by personal ads, and those were all scooped up by Craigslist, so that they can no longer make any money doing that. The rise of the platforms, Facebook, certainly the dominant platform, but Google as well, in their different ways, kind of taking the traffic away from news websites and concentrating it into the aggregators or the platforms like Facebook, like Google News or whatever. And what that's done is that's also undercut, the money that could be made online that way. You've got also the audience, which is less and less discerning in terms of where they get their news. When it all comes to you aggregated in a platform, you don't develop a knowledge of like brand named, newspapers or news outlets. Of course, we all know ABC, CBS, CNN, Fox News and such. But even at the university, I give an assignment, and I say, use a certifiable professional news source, and you get like Joe Blow's blog, published by me from my basement or something. Because people don't really get to know the sources that used to be, the authorities. So there's a loss of that kind of expertise among the audience, and then this whole back and forth about fake news now, where you got people in authority who are calling responsible news reporting fake. You've got a proliferation online of actually fake stories, which arrive to you on the same level as professionally vetted stories, and people don't necessarily have the skills yet, although we try to teach it, but don't have the skills. So a lot of this is the fallout of news moving online, and more and more people getting video news versus print, so on and so forth. So if you have anything to say about that, this could be a great topic, and it's going to be relatively easy to search fake news and come up with some current events which are pertinent to this topic. And next week I'll try to show a little bit of news wars, so you just get a sense of what's going on, what was going on 8 years ago. That's another reason that I sort of stopped showing it. It's a little bit past the point of no return where we are now. Cool. Next up, okay, let's tackle, is anyone maybe interested in writing about kids programming? Because unless there's someone who wants to know about it today, we'll leave it till next week. All right. So this actually will come up probably next week. I don't think we'll have a chance to get to this. But this concept of pro-social programming comes to us through social science research into media. So pro-social means positive social effect. So a lot of media research, we'll get into it right now, criticizes the media and views it as having very negative effects on society. This question asks about, do you think there might be a positive effect through kids watching educational TV? And maybe it's not just educational TV, maybe it's commercial TV for kids too. So we can talk about that the next time if you want. But that could be a fun topic if you are in the mood to reflect upon the kinds of things you saw as a kid. SpongeBob or Disney films, princesses, and
But do you mean like in the recent time or in general?
Well, I wouldn't want you to go back 60 years because then it's kind of like a history project. So it's I think it's better to kind of confine it to the space of your lifetime. Yeah, Ron?
So it's kind of like the critical / cultural approach to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Which I believe you were talking about doing something about heroes, right?
Yeah. It's still kind of foggy. It's hard for me to really connect the dots with it because I'm not sure how big heroes impact, the culture in general.
Yeah.
what they really stand for in real life.
I could see a kind of a bridge from that topic that you were talking about to this. I mean, maybe it's a stretch to say, Heroes is for kids, because it's for young adults and for a really broad audience. But it would be the same approach. Yeah, kind of critical approach, thinking, okay, given what kids are seeing, is that going to lead to a positive effect, a negative effect?
So I just get like 2 positives for that one.
Cool. Well, you should start writing it right away, I think, because if you got ideas already, half the battle is done. Yeah. But we're going to talk about it next class. Next class we got a visitor and extra credit, so the week after. But yeah, and I know some of these things because of my kids and their age. But you may also spend part of your essay explaining to me who was this character and what were the positives or negatives you see about that show. So a good deal of description in there, as well as what Ron's talking about, kind of critical analysis. A cliche about Disney would be princess, and how much people have come to feel that those passive little princesses in their dresses were maybe not sending the right message to young women growing up, and how the latest, the last 10, 15 years of Disney films, you've seen a purposeful transition to, female characters like Moana, or, in Frozen, you start to see even self-conscious mockery of the princess character type of thing, and much kind of, more spunkier, aggressive, realistic in a way, female characters. So that would be one approach you could take, one issue, and there'd be many more. So that'd be a fun topic, I'm sure. Okay, so we'll come back to that one. All right, on to what I think is a pretty interesting topic, of personal and social influence of media. So, we have research done by the industry, for ratings, basically for making money. This is research that's done outside of the industry, trying to get a sense of, what kinds of impacts media have on us. And it turns out to be very difficult to demonstrate strong impacts. We sometimes, off the top of our heads, well, of course, television violence makes people violent, of course, and every time there's a shooting or something, people say, well, what were they watching? They were playing too many video games or something like that, right? It is, right? But then the question is, well, how come everyone doesn't go out and kill, if that's the question, So it's a little far-fetched, those assumptions. So these, researchers try to, with varying success, they try to, use social science methods and stuff to get a better idea of what's going on, which leads to much more limited claims. All right, and so the textbook breaks down a century of research into these issues. It breaks it down into strong effects, limited effects, moderate effects. And it kind of approaches them a little bit out of chronological order, which is, I don't know, not the way I learned it, but it's a way of sort of, trying to come to grips with, 100 years of questioning about media effects in social science. So, but as I said, I think some of the early stuff is some of the most interesting stuff. And some of the first work was spurred on by concerns rising out of the First World War and the role that media played in the First World War. So that was the first war, where radio was just with them, and they were using it mostly as a point-to-point type of communication to facilitate the movement of troops and stuff like that. But there were, of course, textual propaganda. They'd hand out or they'd fly over and dump leaflets on people. Give up, you've lost. All your women back home are sleeping with the people who didn't go to the war. All the rest, all this kind of really negative communication. And after the war, as radio exploded and there was like all of a sudden this, wow, incredible electronic mass medium, people became really concerned, okay, well, you know, that's a powerful tool. How can we assess how powerful it is? What should we do to make sure, you know, that it's gonna, that we can use it positively and not be, you know, for instance, which did happen, you know, you're in a war and they set up a transmitter like, you know, 5 miles away and just blanket, you know, everybody with their propaganda. It could easily happen. So the first model that they came up with was a little crude, and it is being kind of snarkily referred to now as the magic bullet theory. And this was the idea that, that media have a really strong effect, that you hear a message and it kind of goes right into your head, and it's like, oh, you know, Homer Simpson, I want to buy that, or I need that, you know. As though someone shot a bullet into your head with the idea, and boom, it just, oh, okay, I'll do that, you know. Also known as the hypodermic needle. Someone injected you with the message and off you go. A very strong effect, because it doesn't leave you, you know, any agency in this. Why would you see, what could you see as being, you know, a kind of a way to disprove this assertion that when you receive a message, you know, basically take the message and that's the end of the story? What would contradict that?
Critical thinking.
Critical thinking, yes, that's great, for sure. Any examples in everyday life of people engaging in critical thinking around a powerful media message? Anyone that could come to mind? Anybody? How about advertising? How would the world of advertising look if the magic bullet theory actually held? Commercial comes out. According to the model, what happens?
You go and buy the product.
You go and buy the product, right? And we'd all be completely broke because every time a message would come, we could just run out and buy the product, right? So it doesn't account for critical thinking, for our, you know, ability to be unaffected. You know, here's another one: all people affected equally. Maybe you want to have a theory which is a little bit less kind of putting everybody on the same page, and sort of say, well, maybe some people would be affected, not others, you know. And so that could be another one. And that leads, in fact, to, you know, the idea now, who do you think in, you know, again, just in common sense, who do you think is most likely to be affected by media messages as magic bullets? Even if we have critical thinking, you come to school to develop it, you're smart people. Sorry, kids, right? Yeah, absolutely. You know, so you know, so much media literacy kind of concern is directed at kids. Exactly, that's right. And I was far more skeptical of it than when I actually had kids, and then I realized, whoa, they really do want to just go out and buy the thing they saw. It's kind of incredible. However, you can see them buying some piece of junk and getting home and saying, this is crap, this is not like it was at all, right? So you can see critical thinking actually growing in there, you know, and sooner or later it's like, nah, none of that is true, is it, Dad? You know, it's, after they figure out about Santa Claus, then they realize advertising could be manipulative and stuff. So the magic bullet theory was kind of this basic, you know, we're talking about strong effects. Boom, it really has an unmitigated direct effect. Propaganda studies also came right out of the concern after the war. So there's been a little bit of an issue about how to define propaganda. And it's a term that I avoided for a long time just because of those difficulties. The textbook takes an interesting approach. It talks about propaganda as being of messaging that is of greater benefit to the persuader than it is to the persuadee. So in other words, let's say a government wants us to believe a certain thing. Propaganda could be discerned as it's not doing us any favors. It's benefiting whoever is putting it out, but it's not benefiting us necessarily. There are worse definitions of propaganda than that. here contrasted with persuasion being of greater benefit to the receiver. So if we can provide arguments and information which make you think that, something that's useful for you, then the textbook says, well, then you're looking at persuasion. So that's how they sort of tell the difference between propaganda and persuasion. Yeah?
I guess like one is more short and to the point. Like
Which one would you think? Propaganda?
propaganda is just images or something to shock the viewer, not necessarily going any more further. Persuasion is more like, I'm going to convince you that you should do this.
That's a good point. Providing reasoned arguments.
So I think it's about distortion as well.
I think this idea contains the notion that if we don't give you any more information than just the little bit that we need to present our argument, but we don't give you the full picture that you can make up your mind, that is a kind of distortion too, I think. As well as outright lies. I mean, let's face it, maybe what's being given is just complete, BS. It's trying to convince you of something. That's often a possibility too. Have you guys seen? Is there for you any kind of I mean, when we say propaganda, what does any specific medium come to mind, or film, or TV show, or anything like that?
I think of Vietnam.
Pardon me?
I think about like around the time I guess Vietnam Wars and all that.
Oh, okay. So propaganda from our government.
Yeah,
It's true. They did put out a lot of misleading information.
Yeah, it's kind of like, if you don't join us, then you're a communist or something like that.
Interesting point.
Yeah. I think they continue to, with all the stuff that the government does, they throw a lot of propaganda at the people, like to build a wall, or, things like that.
To build a wall, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Oh, there's so many levels of it. That's very true. That's interesting. Jonah?
I mean, I guess like one person opinion, depending on like what side of the coin you're on, but like Fox News is kind of propaganda in a way, because like they're so like leaning like one way. So, like,
The spin is so selective.
Yeah, so it's like definitely a greater benefit to like the persuader in that, like, so I would say that their kind of agenda.
Right, and you won't hear the counter, even though their slogan is fair and balanced, you won't hear the balanced part of it, right? Yeah. But I've heard them actually argue that, well, fair and balanced, what that means is the rest of the media is so unbalanced that we give the right side of it. They look at it, in a different perspective.
Yeah. It's more like they think they're righteous, a sense of righteousness.
Yeah. The true believers are very often the best propagandists. There's a few documentaries which are interesting on this as well. There's one called The War Room, which it happens in the first Gulf War, so not the most recent one, but the first one, and that was the what the Department of Defense did was it wouldn't let any reporters into Iraq. It kept them all in neighboring country. Which one? Begins with a D, I think. Oh my God. Anyhow, doesn't matter. But it brings all of the correspondence from the American press and media and everything, sticks them in this neighboring country. I guess it was Kuwait, I think. Sticks them there, and basically they feed them the news as the Department of Defense wants to give it. And what's so interesting is that the central character, it's a documentary, but kind of the lead character in the documentary is a true believer. It's a Department of Defense communications expert who truly believes that the war is justified and that they're giving the best possible information to all the press. And so he presents that point of view very strongly, and then you have all the press who is like, oh my God, we can't find anything out, we can't go anywhere. And yet, that was the time, I don't know if you know that if you heard about this, I was an adult at the time, but they created this pack of cards. Did you ever hear about that? It's 52 cards of the 52 baddies in Saddam Hussein's regime who had to be got. And so it was kind of like a media stunt. And they would, they say, well, these cards exist and we'll tell you how we're doing at getting Baghdad Bob or at getting, this person or that person. When they printed those cards, there's a great scene where all of the journalists are like running over each other to get like their hands on these cards, at least one of them, It's like kids at a candy store or something. It's so manipulative, and these are professional journalists and stuff, just stuck in that position. So it's a real interesting, examination of our own type of propaganda and how what journalists need is used against them. And after that, they figured, oh, okay, the better thing to do is to embed them. So the second Gulf War, the journalists were put into army units and manipulated in a different way. So pretty interesting. You could do a lot of work on propaganda. Okay, so we said, those are the strong effects, and they each have their difficulties. The magic bullet is kind of like way too blunt. It doesn't account for critical thinking and such. Propaganda runs up against the difficulty of like, well, whose truth? Because once you get down to it, it's like, there are facts on Fox. It's just facts that are selectively presented and stuff like that. And they could look at liberal media and say, well, you're presenting the facts differently. It becomes difficult to sort of just say, that's propaganda, that's not. So we dialed back our efforts and went looking for limited effects. And so in this case, we get rid of the idea that media are all powerful. There may be other things involved rather than just the message. And so they call this the limited effects perspective. In other words, you need a message, you need a receiver. So, what did we talk? We talked about senders, receivers, and the message that goes between them, right? That's our basic media model. And we learned that in the first week or something. So now the idea is that, yeah, this is probably has some effect. It's got to exist to have an effect, but it's a limited effect. There's probably going to be more that goes on than just this kind of beep, 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 beep message into your brain. So now we're looking at a set of theories that say, okay, what more is there? This exists, but what else is there that, this just has a limited effect. What else goes in there? Well, the two-step flow was a theory of, I believe, the 1930s to 50s about. And what this does is it says that somewhere in a side chain, let's say, to bring in another class, sure, there's the message that has to go to the receiver, but there's also opinion leaders somewhere in the midst of this. So let's just insert them into this one chain and say that, sure, it's sender to receiver message is important, but in here there's also what they called opinion leaders. So the actual research where this was hatched was into political influence, looking for long periods, decades, at small American community and saying, okay, look, they're getting all this political messaging. Is that making them vote a certain way? Is that making them change their vote? And what they found out is that you couldn't just think about that and get any kind of consistent result. You had to think about the role of opinion leaders doing the work. So why it's called a two-step flow is the message flows to the opinion leaders influence the receivers. And that produced an actual measurable positive result. So that when you calculate in the influence of opinion leaders, then you find out something significant about how media influences people. In other words, no opinion leaders, not a really very important result. When you count in opinion leaders, then you start to see very influential messages. So what this is teaching us is that electronic communication doesn't happen in a vacuum. It involves people as well, opinion leaders. So now, can you think of any current electronic media where the role of opinion leaders seems to be really important. And again, to say that again, sorry?
Twitter.
Twitter, good, yes. Others?
Instagram.
Yes, let's say social media in general, right? Why? Well, let's think about an advertisement, an advertisement for any product, right? We seem to be pretty fed up with, no matter how beautiful it is, television display ads or something like, it's a gorgeous video of this product, right? But we're all critical thinkers, and we all go, I've seen like 100 things where this little product looked great and it wasn't so great. But if somebody says, someone you know and trust recommends it to you, that's a different story, right? And that is, the role of opinion leaders. So absolutely right. As social media creates this, buffer zone of real, authentic people that we know and trust between us and the source of those electronic messages, then it's a great opportunity for them to try to what do they call them now? They call them influencers. That's even a job description. Does anyone know an influencer in any area? Does anyone know anyone whose ambition is to be an influencer? I got a podcast on my phone which is for influencers. Just search influencers on YouTube and you'll find,
That's
tons of videos.
name that because like
Influencers, what it means is someone...
it's like so many things.
Well, however, they get paid. An influencer is quite specifically gets paid by a first of all, they specialize in particular platforms. They've got, 100,000 Twitter followers or, a sizable chunk of Facebook or Instagram. So they specialize on a platform. There are agencies, which sell the time or work of influencers. And they can make, I've been reading $600 a plug for basically promoting something to their social media community. They're, people who follow them or whatever. So it's an actual job, Jonah, we'll get to you in a second.
That'll be like a sustained thing. Like, is this like a fad, like 5 years?
Good point. I think it only exists for the last 5 years or so, that it's actually, But if you ask me, I think it is sustainable to the extent that, as long as the platforms can keep on, emerging, I think it can. I think it can. My view is sooner. I actually find this kind of fascinating, and we should look some more at it maybe. But think of it, someone emerges within their social media community, their friends or their contacts or their followers or whatever, with a certain, amount of authenticity. It's like, if I start tomorrow promoting something, you're going to look at it and say, well, what is he promoting? Has he promoted a million other things to me already? No. So I might have a certain amount of credibility. By the time I've promoted like 100 different things, and clearly I'm, an interested party, maybe people will start going, yeah, but Malcolm, you keep on promoting the City College courses. You work there. Come on. And so I think that sooner or later influencers burn out because of, what they're lending is their personal authenticity to this. But, depends on how long that lasts, how long that takes. Anybody here, there's this guy, Casey Neistat. Have you anyone not ringing a bell? He had like 1 million followers on YouTube or something. It was sort of this, he would do like kind of well-meaning political exploits. I don't know, there's a drought somewhere. Damn, let's get over there. Let's rent a couple of trucks. Let's bring some barrels of water to these people and videotape the heck out of it. And he was a vlogger, a vlogger on YouTube. And he eventually got a show on CNN and it bombed. So it didn't look like he could actually work in the big media, mass media area. But he's gone back to trying to be an influencer, and I think he's moving off of YouTube because he's kind of burned out there a little bit. So, however, influencers is something to check out. What is this podcast I've got? Whatever, I could post it or something. But yeah, and an interesting possibility to sort of sell your reputation as a recommender on that. So to come back to today's topic, but these are modern day opinion leaders basically, and as cynical and skeptical we are about direct messaging through advertising and such, I think we're still a friend of mine bought it, sounds really good, and I might give it a shot, versus if nobody I know is recommending it to me, no opinion leader is involved, I might just blow it off. It can't be good. So that's important. So that's the two-step flow. Step one is from the advertiser to the opinion leader. Step two is the opinion leader to the consumer, let's say, to put it into advertising notions. The original research was about politics, and so politician would give their speech, and then they'd have all kinds of surrogates who would promote it to their friends, and that's what would get them elected. All right, a very different approach here, coming out of the Army, research in the Army, the Second World War. Now, why would you think that research done in the Army would be, I don't know, why is that a research opportunity if you're the Army?
What's the question?
So let's say that you are going to conduct some research. Why is it advantageous? Why is it an opportunity? Like, let's say, oh wow, this would be cool to work on the Army, to work with the Army.
Like with the Army, not research the Army?
That's right, yeah. So basically what you're doing is you work with the Army to do your research.
Because you get funded by the federal government?
That's part of it. There's money there, yeah. Okay, maybe that was a bad question. But it gives you access to literally millions of people who have to participate in the research, right?
Oh, that's true.
That's the thing. You have trouble, like, imagine how difficult it is to spend 10, 20 years researching a small community in the United States to find out about political messaging. That is like it's the work of a career, right? But if you can build it up with the Army, you can create questionnaires and studies and have them literally done on millions of people who can't, say no. So this was Second World War research into communication methods. And of course, the Army was interested in finding out what kind of communication can we do in order to, inspire our soldiers to make them better warriors, basically. And so as they experimented with, for instance, they would do a questionnaire. They would ask a whole bunch of questions about, your feelings about your country, your feelings about your fellow soldiers, your feelings about the enemy. And then they'd show you some propaganda films, usually made by John Fords, by extremely successful Hollywood directors who were experts at their craft. And then they would give you a questionnaire again, and it's like, okay, now what do you feel about the enemy now? What do you feel? Are you afraid of going into battle? Do you think it's worth it? That's how they would do it. And they came away with some results. Some of those films were noticeably influential, and they also came away with a more differentiated view about who this would work on. So remember, this was one of the early problems, was like all people affected equally. They found that not everyone was affected equally. It all depended on a bunch of selective processes. So some things worked with some people based on the following. They found that based on your, what they called cognition, based on what you thought was true and right, your beliefs before you started, when they measured response to these stimuli, the movies and such, they found out that if you agreed in advance with the basic idea presented, you would seek out messages that confirmed what you believed already. if everyone was shown the same messages, the same films and such, you would see things within those films. You would remark on different things depending on your existing beliefs, your cognition. So let's say, if you thought a certain way about the enemy, those things would stand out. Selective retention, if they measured after the fact what you remember the things that you already, that support your existing belief structure, you remember that better too. So it's all selective, and it all depends on what you believe when you go into the whole set of experiments. So to try to relate this to our current media situation, can you think of examples where audiences engage in selective exposure? In other words, where they will actively avoid media that doesn't support their beliefs. Any examples? Can you think of, like, even yourselves, do you actively avoid some media because you know it's going to disagree with you? Sarah's nodding. Okay. Any specifics? How can we be so quiet? I just wouldn't bother turning on Fox News, even for maybe I've watched like half an hour of my life, and I talk about it like I know anything about it, right? But it's because I know I won't believe the spin. I'll probably just like, it's horrible. Sarah Huckabee Sanders. I will spend no more than 30 seconds watching her spin her stuff from the podium at the White House, because it's selective exposure, right? I don't want to go there. Did you want to say something?
I actively avoid watching television.
Completely? All of it? None of it could confirm what you believe?
I like documentaries and stuff, like Animal Planet,
No, okay.
but
Not regular.
not normal television.
Oh. Do you think it contains, do you think that is it just not interesting, or is it actively something that you
I just feel like
disagree with?
I just feel like it's like information overload,
Oh.
and I'd rather not do that to myself.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Smart.
All right. Selective perception. Have you ever had a disagreement with a friend, like you saw something and you saw it one way and they saw it another way?
Yeah.
Yes? Like what? Any example?
Like literally almost every.
Almost everything.
I don't know, like people get really passionate about economic systems or war or just a lot of things people are very passionate about. I often have a different perspective. Yeah.
More power to you.
Yeah.
It's critical thinking. But yeah, I think it's just sometimes surprising that, I've had this myself on occasion. It's just, you look at something and you're so just like, that's the way I see it. It's as though you're looking at reality, and then somebody right next to you sees it completely different. Perception completely different. Sometimes, or it could just be, you watch something, it's full of messages and such. One stands out to you, but another stands out to somebody else. It's almost inevitable. But so the idea is, again, it's not to labor the point, but this model takes into account that people have a worldview, people have cognition, call it critical thinking, call it, basic intelligence. They see things a certain way. They avoid things that are likely to disagree with them. In our current, media landscape, they literally go searching for the divisive types of content, which will, literally that's what's kind of happening when you've got, a left-wing and a right-wing media, and they're doing their best to, it's better business to shock and upset your own group. That's really what's been working, in current media. Which, were I to say that the media are responsible for the polarization in our culture, I would be, attributing a really strong effect to media. What do you think about that proposition? Could we try debating that for a sec, or just thinking about it? Like the argument that a severely polarized media, which fosters distrust of, the other side's opinion, creates a sort of severely divided society. Do you think there's any credence to that?
They don't give you an in-between.
They don't give you an in-between. I'd like to write that up. Yeah, that's interesting. That's excellent. It's true. By polarizing, they kind of split everybody apart, right?
Yeah.
So what do you think? Do you think, let's say if Fox News disappeared? I mean, again, what did we hear about, the famous Russian intervention into our politics in 2016, right? They, they funded sort of left-wing activists or to have, rallies, and they, pushed through right-wing messages and stuff. I mean, this is, it seems to me, part of what's being documented about, using a media system to kind of create more divisiveness and stuff. So there might be an example we could talk about. Or, the Bill O'Reillys or the Sean Hannitys who are, just constantly saying stuff. Do you think if they didn't exist, that we'd be a more harmonious society?
No.
No? Why, Ron?
Well, it's like, this is a totally unrelated topic.
We've got 2 minutes for a digression. I do it all the time. Go ahead.
So it's almost the same as racism in a way. Like, we'll always find different ways to differentiate ourselves away from each other. I mean, sure, we're similar in several ways, but we'll always try to find something that makes us feel a little bit more unique
Interesting.
and individual from one another. Either from a harmful perspective or like from just, I guess, one way to feel our ego in one way. Depends on like how healthy you are mentally.
Okay. So I'm going to write that up there too. A tendency, let's call it, for social differentiation or something. That's a very interesting idea too. I don't know if that's what we should call it. Identity, I think, comes into it.
Yeah, that's better.
It's a very interesting point. And Jonah, what do you want to say?
I mean, I think that kind of going off what Ron said, I feel like the media might be like a better place. If like personally, like if Fox News on the way, or like some of their like anchors, like, I don't know what her name is. There's like the one lady that always is like bashing someone for like just super disrespectful stuff, and it's just like I feel like if some of those people probably like weren't on the media, like the media overall would be a better place, but like I don't think it would make the world, or like
I see what you mean. Okay.
like, there are issues that are like in the country and like in the world that are like too deeply rooted to like that we can't like eliminate through like the media. Like the media can help like sway, like if we gave like a really like bipartisan or like two sides to like an even story, or like gave it in between, like yeah, it could change something, but like just eliminating someone, I think it would just be like the media might be better off for that than
Got it.
the world.
Yeah. Okay. So and it does seem to build on what Ron was saying too. There's Ron's belief in that there's a kind of a social universal. A kind of everybody needs to differentiate themselves somehow. So the media itself isn't the driver of that tendency. And I think that sounds really credible to me. And then Jonah, what you're saying is the media could nonetheless be a better kind of place of discourse, a place of of information exchange, of learning, and that kind of thing, if it wasn't so polarized, without having to go so far as to say that would fix society, that would fix the differentiations. Yeah, you guys are really reasonable. That's and I think you're also accounting in a way, not for influencers or opinion leaders, but the whole point that that the media and society are distinct, and that it fits together sometimes, but it's not like media just determines what society is, which is a good point. So Ron had a hand up, and then Jonah wants a follow-up too.
I also forgot to mention.
Yeah.
I said it's supposed to be polarizing, right? It's TV. It's so polarizing. TV is supposed to be polarizing. Otherwise, it's not entertainment.
Okay.
Without it, you kind of lose your audience that way.
Got you. So there's an interest in the media in keeping it polarized? Is that what you-
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not only that, but it's like you can't get rid of all the trolls.
Yes.
You can't. It's not possible. It can't be done.
Yeah. Thankfully, some of them stopped coming to class, but you can't get rid of all of them. It's true. Absolutely. Yeah. Jonah?
I was just kind of had another idea. I feel like if social media was eliminated, I think that would have a bigger impact on the world.
Interesting.
I think if like Facebook or like Instagram or Twitter were
Right.
eliminated, I think there would be more like identity, like more like different. I feel like those things like really like box people in.
Yeah.
And like you see a lot of like if you go on Instagram, like you'll see a lot of like women that look identical to like every Kardashian. That's the thing. Like people all like look the same on Instagram, and I feel like there's not much like independent thinking on social media. Or like if there is, it's kind of like looked at in like just read comment section, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because in a way it sounds like what you're saying is, we should go back to the mass media with gatekeepers, with the the way that ABC, CBS, NBC could impose the kind of standard on everybody. And it's interesting because on that reading, then it's kind of like, well, social media had that potential to turn everybody into a broadcast. Everyone could now broadcast their identity. What did they choose to do? A lot of them kind of mimic, opinion leaders like the Kardashians or something. It's true. At least what you're getting is a kind of a, how could I put it? People have a certain amount of agency in the social media landscape. It seems though that they tend to kind of voluntarily massify in a weird way. And this is all theoretical, but it's an interesting thing you point to.
And I feel like there are algorithms like in those like softwares that are like meant to like push a certain.
This is what we're led to understand.
People can pay well, I don't know if it actually works. People can like pay Instagram to like have their posts seen by people. Like,
I mean, yeah, you can.
Like a pipeline where there's like Instagram is trying to like funnel like X amount of stuff into your feed, or like Facebook as well.
Absolutely. To you in one sec, but what did we hear was that even without transaction, without money, the algorithms in the platforms boost content with proven engagement factor. It's like, more people forward this type of content, so we'll surface more of this type of content. And it seems that has led, into like kind of partisan hotspots, because that's what gets people doing the most, engaging and exchanging. So even if it's not Kardashians, even if it's, the hater of the month, or or whatever, some super liberal type of outrage or something, it seems that those poles of outrage were getting lifted. Now they say, we're not going to pump those up so much, we're going to give more family photos or something like that. I don't know. Anyway, Sarah, you should say something. Yeah.
I disagree with this, just because I think that before the social media, people used to have less critical thinking, just because you used to trust this big font of information.
Right, like the centers of information in the mass media world.
Yeah, also, I think the social media are a font for good journalism to go deeper into news.
Yes?
If I think, for example, about the war, a lot of time they start from social media posts, for example.
They have to. They have no other contact in some cases.
And then they go, the good journalists, they go deeper to check if it's true or not, that news, and then they tell you something else.
I see, yeah.
Because it's very difficult to understand if the news is real or distorted or whatever.
Yeah.
But I just think, like, in my experience, for example, and we had fascism in Italy, which was very important, I think, for us to
develop yes.
even a certain critical thinking after.
And
with social
fascism worked very closely with mass media, right? It was like you
was
just you take over all the radio and TV stations, and
Yeah.
no one can argue with you.
And that is also how Berlusconi that then won. It uses the same kind of like, that was amazing, because after, I mean, with social media and everything, you could see how much the communication model Berlusconi used in the beginning of the 90s to win the election was like similar, like super similar to Mussolini.
Wow.
Same thing in different time. And that is probably the reason why here nowadays, which is like shocking, Trump can win an election, and I don't think that could happen in Europe.
I don't know about being able to argue that one, but the first thing that you're saying seems like totally credible. You know, that we're that in a mass media environment we can be kind of just shut down.
I agree with him too. Like, I think social media can be very beneficial when it comes to actually having like hard, like video, like truth of what is happening, as opposed to like big corporations portraying this knowledge too. Also, it is essential for like community organizing nowadays. Like, that's how you reach out to members in your community when you're trying to advocate for some issue.
Yeah. You know, I'm reminded of like guns don't kill people, people do. It's like, you know, Twitter doesn't create misinformation, people do. I think, you know, I think the media platforms have never been more diverse and interesting, but people have to use them responsibly. You know, I think that's what you're saying. It's kind of like we could characterize social media as the place where the Kardashian clones gather, or we could, you know, characterize it as the place where, you know, the Arab Spring begins or the next social revolution emerges and nobody can shut it down. And both are damn true, you know. Who ultimately is responsible are the users, you know. And if you look to Mark Zuckerberg to arrange this, I don't think that somebody can really, you know, all that effectively just like tweak the algorithm so that there's only a positive outcome, you know, I think. But these are all really good points, you know, really good points. And, you know, when you look at social media and the way that it's misused so much, you know, you gotta be on the side of critical thinking and an educated, you know, media user base. And like we have a social media class here, which I encourage everybody to take. And I sure hope it goes beyond. I mean, Andrea Medina is teaching it, and she's, you know, super person, great education and stuff. I'm sure she's doing a great job. And I hope that there's some part of it is dedicated to, you know, using social media for not just promoting yourself professionally, but also, you know, for the better good if you can figure out how that works, you know. But just, you know, like every day, participate if you can, you know, instead of what my friends do, which is post pictures of their kids looking cute. You know?
That's the social media for professionals.
Yeah,
that class.
right. Are you going to take it?
I was thinking about it. I was looking at all the classes.
It's required for some.
I didn't
Yeah.
want to, but
So when you talk to Andrea, tell her, you know, I hope we're going to be doing some, you know, kind of social activist or something good, you know.
it depends a lot on the teacher. I had a bad conception just because of the title, I think. So I was like, oh, you know, depending on the teacher, could be like very interesting or like super like.
No, it's very new, and Andrea is she's very cool.
No, I know her,
Yes,
so
you
I'm
do.
happy to know that she's teaching.
Yeah, she is. I think she basically put the class together, and so I think that's really good. Yeah, I just, you know, it just seems to me, I had this realization a while back that it's just like, hey, it's a tool, right? And so if people used it well, it wouldn't be as bad as it is, or it appears to be. You know? Sorry about the gun analogy, that probably was poorly chosen. Oh, let's see if maybe, thank you. This is the most interesting class in a long time because of your excellent contributions. So, gosh, only a few more minutes. So we talked about strong effects as being kind of like doubtful as to how, or difficult to sustain claims around strong effects, no matter how much I continually come back and find myself like about to make a kind of claim for a strong effect. Limited effects, I think, are much more interesting, and notice how the conversation took off when we got to, you know, a kind of a theoretical model which accounted for cognition, critical thinking, belief systems, and, you know, the participation of social beings in media, you know, and Ron spoke to that when he said that everyone wants an identity, you know, everybody's looking to differentiate themselves, you know, and I think that's a fact. It used to be sort of, you know, you could do it through your social group or through, you know, I mean, stereotypes didn't just created with media. I mean, they've been a part of social groups and the way they interact for a long time. But the media takes those stereotypes and, you know, turns them into kind of realistic fantasy images that, you know, play out in front of us on TV, and that's pretty powerful. Okay, so we talked about strong effects, we talked about limited effects, now we are on to moderate effects. And here, you know, it's like, okay, moderate effects, limited effects on viewers, advertising was persuasive, concerns. Okay, this is where we want to go in this class, and then we'll pick it up next week, I guess, because we've got our visitor. Bandura's modeling theory, which I could explain it to you in a second, but the topic here, which was a big topic starting in the 1960s, was violence on TV and advertising on TV and how they impact and affect kids. Because that's a decade in which Congress gets involved beyond the FCC, which, remember, has been protecting us from offensive words and things like that, which, you know, they are related to excretory functions or sexual functions. And so that was their kind of area of interest. But Congress got interested in, you know, what's advertising, all this TV advertising. Remember, TV comes up late 50s, right? By the mid 60s, everybody's kids are being radiated with, you know, advertising messages. So they create some laws about, you know, what kinds of claims you can make in children's advertising, how much advertising can you put into a Saturday morning, those things. And also, you know, there are questions about violence. And so then they start doing research. How many dead people do you see, you know, in a year watching TV, you know? And it's like, oh my God, kids, you know, they see thousands of murders every, you know, in their lifetime, you know? And in fact, most of us, hopefully, will never actually experience, you know, or come close to experiencing a murder. But by watching TV, you're just inundated with all of this. And so, you know, this signals a new area of media research, which is connected to the government wanting to, you know, make sure that they do protect the population, of course. So on the issue of violence, there's early research into how kids can be influenced by violent imagery to become violent themselves. So of course this comes up, right? You get a Columbine and it's like, hey, those guys, they were playing all kinds of violent games. And one of the early experiments to work on this had to do with showing kids films of other kids beating up Bobo dolls. So those are those clowns, they're inflatable clowns where you punch them and they fall down and then they bounce back up, right?
Yeah.
So they showed a whole bunch of kids these films of other kids beating the heck out of these Bobo dolls. And then they turned the kid, after the movie, they put the kid in an empty room with a Bobo doll in the corner, and say, okay, take 10, we'll be back. And they're watching from behind, mirrored glass windows, and then looking to see, which kids come in and start pounding the Bobo doll, based on having just seen a movie doing this. And from that, they can extract, the kids who saw the movie of another kid beating up the Bobo doll are much more likely to go in the room and beat up that Bobo doll than another kid who hadn't seen the movie and they just put him in the room and say, wait for your mom, and that's it. So it's elegant in its kind of simplistic way, but what it winds up showing you is that, kids will imitate behavior they see. What else? Jonah?
How do you account for like a kid knowing that, like, if a kid knows it's a doll, how you assume that, like, hopefully a kid, like, how do you know if a kid knows, like, right from, I think that doesn't really
Good point.
lead to any, like, conclusion.
Very good
Like,
point.
This is a horrible experiment and definitely shouldn't be done, but it would be different if, like, you showed, like, a kid a violent movie and then put him in the room with, like, a weapon or something like that.
Right,
Like-
right, and actually harm somebody.
Yeah,
right?
like, I feel like a kid wouldn't necessarily do that,
Yes, I agree.
Like, I don't know, like, violent video games are wildly popular. Like, Grand Theft Auto 5 has been, like, a top-selling game for the past 5 years, and I don't think, like...
People are not driving down the
Yeah.
sidewalk. Well, they are. But
Oh, yeah, I mean, like, people do stupid stuff all the time.
Yes.
Like, I don't think, like, you can really make, like,
absolutely, absolutely.
it's not really, like...
When I hear what you're saying, I agree, and I think I see a continuity with a tendency to, early on in research to discount critical thinking, cognition, or whatever. What you're saying is a kid is smart enough to know that by punching a doll, he's not actually harming anybody, So the fact that a kid would imitate that kind of behavior doesn't mean that a kid would imitate truly destructive behavior, and that's a good point because of cognition. Yeah.
I find it interesting that they decided to start like censoring violent news content within the 1960s, which was during the civil rights movement. And I would imagine that most of that news content would be concerning African Americans. And so I feel like it's just interesting that they decide to censor that at that time. And I just wonder what interests were in mind,
That's a good point. That's a good point. And another thing that got out that they censored eventually, or just always when we talk about censorship, usually we're talking about self-censorship. The networks, but it was coverage of the Vietnam War, because at that time they didn't. They had no real policy for broadcast journalists. They could basically, if you were a camera operator in Vietnam or something, if you could hitch a ride on a helicopter to the front line, if they would take you, not always, but if you were, just savvy enough, you could get on and you'd arrive. They have film of the My Lai, of burning villages and stuff. They have film of horribly mutilated GIs, just like dying. And they would actually put some of this on the air at the time. And so that was another thing that they were, eventually it was like their pressure was brought on the networks, and they started to, suppress some of the worst stuff.
I feel like they're also like distorting reality. Like they don't want to show the truth of what is actually going on. And for whatever reason.
Well, that leads to a super heavy philosophical concept, which is, how do you really understand the totality of reality? Every viewpoint is a limited viewpoint, but some are, more misleading than others. I would totally agree with that. Anyhow, we got to go. We're already 2 minutes past. I can't believe it. Usually we're all ready to get out of here 15 minutes early. So thank you for a sweet, super discussion. So on Thursday, we've got extra credit, right? Do come back.